Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're looking at a question that a lot of you have been asking about. Are women better negotiators?
Ooh, that's a good one.
It is a good one. You sent over this article from the Negotiation Skills Academy called Are Women Better Negotiators? A research-based study. So we're going to kind of break that down
Sounds good.
and see what the research says.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many stereotypes around gender and negotiation
Right.
that don't necessarily always line up with reality.
Yeah, and it's like there's almost like two kind of competing narratives, right?
Uh-huh.
You have this idea of like women being really good at like haggling, like at a flea market.
Right.
But then when it comes to like the big business deals, the really high stakes negotiations,
Yeah.
it's almost like that's portrayed as like a man's world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those portrayals, even when they're sometimes played for laughs, do reflect some deeply ingrained societal expectations. For a long time, women were often relegated to managing the household budget. So the stereotype was that they were good at negotiating for like everyday needs, but men were more often seen in those formal business and political roles. And that fueled the idea that they were the masters of high stakes negotiation.
Right. And it's so interesting because even in movies, like you see both sides of it. Like you have a movie like Erin Brockovich,
Oh, yeah.
where she's like amazing at fighting for what she believes in, and The Devil Wears Prada.
Huh.
Like Meryl Streep is like this ultimate power player in the fashion world.
Yeah.
So clearly, it's not like women are shying away from tough negotiations.
Yeah, I think those are great examples of how pop culture can sometimes challenge those stereotypes, even if unintentionally.
Right.
And as more and more women have entered the workforce and risen to leadership positions, they've brought their own styles and approaches to negotiation, which has really started to shift the landscape.
Right. Okay, well, let's get into some of the research then, because the article that you sent mentions a bunch of different studies that are kind of looking into whether there really are differences in how men and women approach negotiation.
Yeah, and one of the most intriguing areas of research is around avoiding impasse, especially when you don't have a lot of alternatives. One study by Anima Rebecca Ponce de Leon and Ashley Shelby Rosette found that women actually tend to excel in these scenarios.
Interesting. So, like, when the stakes are high
hmm
and there's not a lot of wiggle room, they're good at, like, coming to a solution.
Well, the study suggests
Mhm.
that women tend to be less aggressive in their opening offers,
Go-
which might seem counterintuitive,
Mhm.
but it actually led to higher agreement rates
Interesting.
in these specific situations.
So it's not about, like, coming in with a really hard line. It's more about, like, finding common ground and reaching a solution that works for everyone. I mean, that makes sense, especially if you're in a context where you need to preserve relationships or if resources are limited. Like, you can't just walk away from the table.
Exactly. But I do want to be clear. It's not that women are inherently less assertive negotiators across the board. It really depends on the context. Another researcher, Yuri Nizi from the University of California, San Diego, found that when you put people in more structured, collaborative environments that require a lot of cooperative behavior, women actually outperform men in those settings.
Oh, interesting. So if it's like an environment that really emphasizes teamwork
Uh-huh.
and like that win-win mentality, that's where women really thrive.
Right, but Gneezy's research also found kind of a flip side to that. In more competitive, ambiguous situations, where individual assertiveness is rewarded, men tended to perform better.
So again, it's like
Yeah.
it's not that one is better than the other. It's that different contexts call for different approaches
Yeah.
and different people excel in different environments.
I think that's a key takeaway. It's not about saying one way is always better. It's about understanding the nuances and
Yeah.
adapting your negotiation style to the
Yeah.
situation at hand.
Right. So we talked about how context matters. And we've kind of touched on some strengths that women seem to bring to negotiation. The article goes into a few of these strengths in detail. One of them is empathy and active listening. I mean, those are good communication skills in general, right?
They are. But when you apply them specifically to negotiation, they can be incredibly powerful tools. What's fascinating is that those skills, empathy and active listening, enable women to really understand the other party's perspective. And I'm not just talking about what they're saying explicitly, but also their underlying interests, needs, and motivations.
So it's about like reading between the lines and going beyond just the surface level to like really get to the heart of what the other side wants.
Exactly. And that deeper understanding can lead to more creative, more mutually beneficial solutions. It's about finding that sweet spot where everyone feels like they're getting something that they value.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about another strength that they highlight, which is sensitivity to nonverbal cues. I feel like this is something that people often underestimate in negotiation.
It's absolutely crucial. Think about it. We communicate so much through our body language, our facial expressions, even subtle shifts in our tone of voice. And women, according to a lot of research, are often more attuned to those nonverbal signals, which can give them a real edge in understanding what the other person is truly thinking or feeling, even if they're not saying it directly.
Yeah, it's almost like having this extra layer of information to work with, which is super valuable when you're trying to gauge the other side's reaction and tailor your approach accordingly.
Exactly. Being able to pick up on those unspoken cues can help you adjust your strategy on the fly, which is essential in any negotiation.
Right. So empathy, active listening. Picking up on those nonverbal cues, another strength that the article mentions, is something we already touched on, which is that collaborative approach, like that win-win mindset.
It is a powerful approach, and research suggests it can be particularly effective for women. Instead of viewing negotiation as a zero-sum game, where one person wins and the other loses, it's about finding a way for everyone to walk away, feeling like they've gained something.
Right. And I imagine that leads to more sustainable agreements in the long run.
Right.
Because if both sides feel like they got a fair deal, they're more likely to uphold their end of the bargain and maintain a good relationship going forward.
Absolutely. Building trust and fostering strong relationships are key to successful negotiation, and that collaborative approach can be a real asset in achieving those goals.
Oh, right. Okay, two more strengths that we should touch on. One is adaptability and flexibility. I mean, this seems like it would be essential in any negotiation.
Right.
Things rarely go exactly according to plan.
You're absolutely right. Negotiation is a dynamic process, and you need to be able to adjust your approach as new information emerges or obstacles arise. And what's interesting is that research suggests women are often more adept at this kind of flexibility. They're more willing to shift their strategies, modify proposals, and find creative workarounds.
When faced with challenges, so they're able to kind of pivot.
Yeah.
And find solutions even when the path isn't clear-cut. I mean, that's valuable in any context, especially in a world that's constantly changing, and you can't always predict what's going to happen next.
It is. That kind of adaptability is essential for navigating the complexities of negotiation and finding win-win solutions even when things get tough.
Yeah. And then finally, the article highlights resilience in the face of setbacks. I mean, given all the challenges we've talked about already, especially around biases and stereotypes, it seems like this would be a crucial quality for any negotiator, but perhaps even more so for women.
It's absolutely essential, especially given the systemic barriers that women often face. The research shows that women often encounter higher rejection rates and encounter more resistance in negotiation settings. But despite those obstacles, they demonstrate remarkable persistence. They don't give up easily.
So even though they're facing an uphill battle in many cases, they keep pushing forward and advocating for what they deserve.
They've learned to navigate a system that isn't always fair and to keep striving for their goals. Even when they encounter roadblocks, it's a testament to their strength and determination.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the strengths that women bring to the negotiation table. But, we want to make sure we don't shy away from the challenges either, because even with all these strengths, there are still significant obstacles that women face. So what are some of the key takeaways from the research on that front?
One of the most consistent findings is that women often face higher resistance and achieve lower success rates in pay negotiations, even when they initiate these conversations, just as often as men do. Laura Cray, Jessica Kennedy, and Margaret Lee did a study on this and found that women often encounter a sort of pushback effect. Imagine putting yourself out there, asking for what you deserve, and repeatedly being told no, or facing roadblocks that your male colleagues simply don't experience. It can be incredibly discouraging.
Yeah, I mean, that's frustrating, especially when you consider the fact that they're often just as prepared, just as qualified as their male counterparts.
Exactly, and it points to the deeply embedded biases that continue to operate in many workplaces.
So even though they're asking, they're not getting the same responses.
Oh.
Why is that? Is it that people are just consciously discriminating against women?
Well, it's rarely that straightforward. The research suggests that there are several factors at play. One is that women are often penalized for assertive behavior in ways that men are not.
Oh, so you mean there's a double standard?
Yeah.
Where assertive behavior is seen as a positive trait in men, like strong, decisive leader. But when a woman displays that same assertiveness, it's perceived negatively, like she's being aggressive or pushy.
Or difficult.
Exactly. And that double standard can make it incredibly difficult for women to advocate for themselves effectively without facing backlash.
It's like they're damned if they do and damned if they don't.
Right. If they're not assertive enough, they're seen as passive or lacking confidence. But if they are too assertive, then they get penalized for it. It's a real catch-22.
It is. And it highlights the need for greater awareness of these biases and for organizations to create cultures where women feel empowered to negotiate and their contributions are valued.
Right. The article also mentioned that women in general experience higher rejection rates in negotiations overall. So not just about pay, but just like across the board.
That's right. It's a pattern that emerges in various studies, and it's likely due to a combination of factors, including those implicit biases we just discussed.
So it's not just that they're negotiating less, it's that they're facing more resistance, even when they do kind of step up to the plate.
And that resistance can take many forms. It could be subtle, like being interrupted more frequently or having their ideas dismissed. Or it could be more overt, like being told their requests are unreasonable or being offered less favorable terms than their male counterparts.
Yeah, and I imagine that constant battle against these preconceived notions and stereotypes takes a toll. It's like a psychological burden that men often don't have to carry.
Absolutely. And it can create a vicious cycle where women start to doubt their own abilities, hesitate to negotiate in the future, or even internalize those negative stereotypes.
I mean, which is a huge loss because, as we've seen, they bring so much to the table.
Right.
Their strengths and collaboration.
Right.
And empathy and adaptability are such valuable assets in any negotiation setting.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to acknowledge and address these systemic biases head on. It's not just about encouraging women to negotiate more. It's about creating a system where they can negotiate effectively and on a level playing field.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground already, from stereotypes and historical context to the specific strengths and challenges that women face. When it comes to negotiation, we've touched on some of the research that's kind of shedding light on these issues, but we still have so much more to explore, particularly around those shifting trends and evolving stereotypes that you mentioned earlier.
You're right. We've only scratched the surface. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into how those gender roles are changing in the workplace, how women's negotiation styles are evolving, and what that means for the future of negotiation, particularly as it relates to closing those persistent gender pay gaps.
I'm looking forward to that. Well, thanks for joining us so far for part 1 of this deep dive. We'll be back soon with part 2.